sermon series we're going to be focused on for the next few weeks will be 24 Hours to Change the World is the name of it. We are on Wednesday night Bible studies. We are working through a book called 24 Hours to Change the World. But what we're doing is examining the very last day that Jesus was alive. And it starts with the Last Supper. And then it goes through his betrayal, through his beating, through his court conviction in front of the Sanhedrin, and then, of course, to his crucifixion and death. So that's what we're going to try to be examining together throughout the coming weeks. But here we start at the Last Supper. And there's one particular thing that I wanted to share with us this morning, and it was when Jesus foretells his betrayal. And I think, hopefully by the end of this, we will be able to understand how it very much so relates to our own life when we try to think of this in a metaphorical sense. But the Last Supper, the Passover meal, of course, is something that Jews celebrate. And the Passover meal is the most important time for the Judaism faith. And what happens in the Passover, the meal that they're partaking of, is that as you would eat certain things, there's different foods that you would eat, but you would retell the story of the Passover. And it's the most important story for the Hebrew people. The story of the Exodus, the story of how they were, if you take the story literally, they were slaves in Egypt. They were being beaten. They were having to do all the work for the pharaohs. They were calling out to God, and God answered them and rescued them. But instead of, we all know the story of they made it to the border of Palestine. And they were going to be able to enter into the Promised Land. And of course they sent out spies. Moses sent out spies. Some of them, all of them came back except for two with very negative reports that they didn't want to do it. God was angered. And of course they spent 40 more years in the wilderness before they ever actually was able to enter into the Promised Land. If you think of this in a metaphorical sense, it's very similar to our Christian lives. You think about how we are born into sin. We are sinful creatures by nature. We, at the moment of our salvation, through justifying grace, we realize that. We call out to God, and He answers us. But when we live the Christian life, we find out that it's not always easy. That sometimes it's very tough and very hard. And if you relate that to the 40 years of roaming in the wilderness, it's very much so similar to our Christian lives. But eventually, as we all know, we all have the opportunity, we all get the privilege of entering into the Promised Land. So that's the story that's being talked about at this meal. Jesus, being the rabbi, was surely teaching this again to his disciples. And then he started doing a lot of unique things that the disciples had trouble understanding at the time. He washes their feet. He gives them the love story of the love commandment that they should love one another as he has loved them. But then in the midst of all this really good things, he turns and he starts to give something very negative. He tells about his betrayal. Now, if you're familiar with the Gospels, before the Gospel of Luke tells us that before this meal, Judas had already agreed for 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. He had already agreed to it. He already knew it was going to happen. Jesus wasn't telling him anything he didn't know. He was just telling something that the rest of the disciples didn't have a clue about. And we still find out that even after he says it, the disciples still didn't have a clue about it. But something strikes me very interesting in seeing that Judas knew that he was going to betray Jesus. He knew that this was going to happen, that he was going to be responsible for Jesus' death. But he still came to that supper. Judas knew where Jesus was going to be. But it still strikes me very oddly that he knew that was going to happen. He knew who Jesus was. He knew he was the Son of God. He knew all things. He knew that he could perform any miracle that he wanted to. But yet Judas still went to that supper. And we learned in our Bible study class that The table that they were sitting at is not much like the actual Da Vinci painting that we see, but it was like a horseshoe shape. And we understand through deductive reasoning that Jesus was sitting at the place of honor, and beside of him were two seats. And one of those seats, John, the beloved, sat. But we found out that the other place of honor, Judas sat at. I think that's very interesting that Jesus, of course, already knew this. Judas, of course, already knew this. And still, Judas was sitting in the place of honor. Judas had already agreed to betray Jesus, and yet he still came into his presence hiding something. I think that has a lot to do with our own lives when we start thinking about that. I think so many of us live in sin, willingly, knowingly. We claim to be Christians, but we don't act anything like Christians. But yet we still come into the presence of God. We come to church. We go to Bible studies. But we're hiding something. And I know that because I've lived through this myself, going to church, living two separate lives. And every time I come into the presence of God, He calls me out. I'm focused on that thing. I know that thing that I'm doing is wrong. Judas must have felt exactly the same way. He came into the supper. He was hiding something. And God called him out. Christ called him out.